So I had a viewer ask me to do a video on translation, and I was like, well, I've been meaning to do that, and I've been trying to figure out how to address it, and I realized that wasn't the issue. The issue is that I have 3 translations of this book, and I've read this one, which is a really unusual translation method, and I wanted to read these 2 more conventional translations to see what I got out of them in order to see what I thought of the translation method in this book. However, I still think I can talk about translation without having done that, because I have read a lot of books in translation. I know, not like an expert, like basically what I know is translation, you're making a trade-off between fidelity towards how the author was writing, and accuracy, cultural accuracy, versus readability for a reader in a different cultural context. And so there's a number of ways to address that. And so this is interesting to me. This is a part of a series, and it's print on demand, but it's actually... the books are decent quality, like the covers are actually... So I've said that I have gotten books that are print on demand and actually like on the level of professionally printed books like once or twice, and this is one of those times. And it's done by, so I think it's father and son team. Eugene Ying, I believe, he's an engineer who came up with what he considers a revolutionary translation method, and then his son annotated these books with information, context about Chinese history that the reader who might not know. And Eugene Ying's idea was basically to translate stuff, not exactly literally, but sort of capturing the spirit. So translate like place names that wouldn't be translated. And so I was frequently trying to, because I'm familiar enough with Chinese geography, trying to reconstruct what are some of these. Like I picked up on Nanjing and Beijing, and I think Henan and Hunan, but might not have been in this book. They've done a couple that I've read at least part of. But in general, I was... like, I don't know, and I'm curious what are these places, but it also didn't really matter for the story. And I found this a really interesting story that I might talk about in a future video. But the first time I read it, I was like, I find this writing style insufferable because it's very different than typical translations. And of course, English and Chinese are very different languages, so it's hard to get faithful translation. And one thing that's interesting, so I really recommend this comic series by Tsai. The introductions talk about how a lot of experts on like ancient Chinese texts say that he does a good job of capturing scholarly interpretations of the comics. And unfortunately, I think all or most of these are selected passages, so he doesn't do everything in these texts, but it makes them way easier to read. And so that does like comic illustrations. And this version is from Princeton. And Princeton ones are a little bit nicer, especially in terms of typesetting. But there's also bilingual English-Chinese editions that you can get that are frequently a little bit cheaper and have more variety than what Princeton has put out. And if you want to check it out and want to check out the Princeton one, I usually recommend checking out The Way of Nature, which is the Zhuangzi, the second best-known Taoist text, because it's a really interesting text. I think I've said my favorite Taoist text is the Liezi, but I think that one is less accessible. This one is more accessible, and of course, you have the Princeton version. And so this is one way of actually handling translation, is doing comic illustration that's original. And he did it to translate from ancient Chinese to modern Chinese, because a lot of the references were lost on modern readers. And I think like that might work with, certainly when I was a kid, I had a comic version my father got me of the Odyssey, and then I also had a picture book version. They're both abridged, and I didn't read the full Odyssey until high school. So it's certainly an option. And then you also read this for a book club, and I like this kind of book. This character is kind of insufferable. But I still found the stories mostly charming. He's kind of what we would call like a hustle bro today. He actually fits that stereotype pretty well, because we would typically consider hustle bros to be like lower class from rural areas kind of rubes. And they have the same attitude of, what's in it for me? Can I get something for free? And that is the obsession of this character. But there were a lot of footnotes talking about Bulgarian history, and I knew a lot of this because I have read a fair bit about the history of Eastern Europe. But a lot of it I didn't know too, especially like the internal Bulgarian political stuff. And then there were just a lot of stuff. They're like, yeah, we can't translate this in a way that's going to convey, so we're just going to translate it into English, and some of this nuance will be lost. And that is always the issue with translation, is there's often cultural references that don't translate. And then another interesting thing in translation, so this translation, The Three-Body Problem by Cixin Liu, is translated by Ken Liu, who is a science fiction writer I love, and Cixin Liu said that he thought this translation was better than his original work, because Ken Liu cut out a lot of stuff in the story that was not really relevant to the narrative. And that's one of the things I feel about good writing, is figuring out what is not necessarily and cutting it. And there are atmospheric books where, like, it's part of the atmosphere, but if that's not what you're doing, then yeah, cutting it out is great. And I have not read the original in Chinese, so I don't know if I would agree with that, but I do know Goethe's Faust, this translation by Walter Kaufmann, and generally, like, if I'm getting a book translated from German, if Walter Kaufmann translated it, I'm getting the Kaufmann translation, because people seem to agree he's the best translator. And he cut out huge chunks of the second book of Faust, because Faust was originally in 2 books. And I have a friend who's into philosophy and went and found and read the whole second book and is like, yeah, everything he cut out is really, it was a good thing to give it a miss, and I would not recommend trying to read it. Like, what Kaufmann preserved here is what is worth actually reading. And then Brothers Karamazov. So I've mentioned, well, in a video that may come out before this one, the reason I haven't read this is because it's tiny text. And again, the cutoff point for me seems to be 9-point text is fine, 8-point text annoys me, and this might actually be like 6-point text. But I wanted this specific translation by Richard Pevear and Larissa Volokhonsky. And so this is a husband and wife team. The wife is a native Russian speaker. She translates it to English sort of first pass, and then he goes and he cleans it up to be more fitting for a native English speaker. She also, I think, notes like a lot of, this is like issues in translation, and then he'll do the English translation in discussion with her. And so this is an approach that works great if you have 2 people who are, one's a native speaker of the original language, one is the target language. And generally I've heard people say that if they have translated a work from Russian, the best translation is from them. And so every Russian book I've bought, pretty much, where I've had a choice of translation, they've done it, I've gotten it. Some of them they don't. Like, I want to read Turgenev, Fathers and Sons, and at least when I looked, they hadn't. So I got a copy that seemed to be, the way I was reading about it, the translation that sounded like it would best fit me. And then that one was a tiny book with tiny text, so I haven't read that one either. And then you have, so when I talked about Borges, there was someone in the comments saying, oh, the Andrew Hurley translations are awful. There's another translation that Borges did in collaboration with someone else. And Borges was actually a native English speaker. His grandmother was English, and he was raised speaking English. And he said he thought English was a better language for storytelling than Spanish. And yet, as far as I know, he gave talks in English, but he never wrote anything in English. And he certainly didn't translate his own works, but he did collaborate with a translator on a later translation that I don't have, but I do want to check out. Especially there is one book in here that I think it was The General History of Infamy, that I struggled with some of the stories, and I'd like to see if in this other translation it comes across better to me. Most of it I had no trouble with, despite his reputation, even in the Hurley translation. And then finally, wanted to mention, so I actually got to meet Orhan Pamuk shortly after I was deported from Turkey, which video on that up here, I guess. But the interesting thing is, so he reads and approves and like notes all of his English translations. So because he's a fluent English speaker, and so he doesn't do the translation himself, I believe, but he does. Or does he? Let me double check. Yeah, no, he doesn't. Yeah, different translator. Maureen translated this one, but he mentioned all his English translations he reads and like notes where he thinks the translation got things wrong, which is, again, when you have the author of the book speaks the language and has the opportunity to do it, that's a great opportunity for these translations. I think Cixin Liu also speaks English, I'm not sure, given his comments on Ken Liu's version being better. But at any rate, so I don't have any really coherent thoughts on translation. I wanted to share some of these quick observations and thoughts, and I may have something more coherent later. But I was like, I wanted to make a video on this. Someone asked me, and I'm like, I still haven't read the other 2 versions of this book, but I probably won't do that anytime soon. So let's sort of get these thoughts out here. And I don't have I think the good translator finds the right balance between being overly technical and having a lot of stuff that most readers won't get, and translating too much to the target audience and losing the nuance. But I found the difference in these translation approaches to some degree, I guess, interesting. Don't really have a thesis here. Anyways, thanks for watching. I'm Magpie. This here is Leela, and I'll see y'all in the next one.